welcome to another edition of the Domino Theory television program, which is aired locally here in San Francisco, California, on channels 29 and 76. We appreciate your viewership for sure, since ours is, I would say, the most unique programming in the Bay Area, of course. We as public access have a responsibility to bring you news and other information that you won't see on other channels, and we do a pretty good job of handling that, I think, not all the time, but most of the time. So, like I said before, we appreciate your tuning into our channels and listening to our variations of programming. They come to you streaming 24 hours a day, as a matter of fact. I'd like to say thank you for all of you who participated in the election, and I would also like to say congratulations, first of all, to our President and Mrs. Obama, and I'd also like to say he was re-elected by a coalition of people who came together, who recognized the situation that our country is in, that our country is facing at this particular time in history. There were young people, there were senior citizens concerned about Social Security. The young people were concerned about their college educations and their tuition issues. There were African Americans, of course, who voted for the first black president and voted to re-elect that African American president. Unfortunately, there were very few others besides women, we want to include the women also, that voted for the president. We hope that those people will recognize the fact that our country needs that type of cohesiveness. This is not just a country of white people or black people, but it's a country of so many variations of color. It is just phenomenal. In San Francisco, you can ride a bus and listen, if you eavesdrop, like I often do. You can hear, pardon me, 15 different conversations going on in 15 different languages. And I think that's beautiful. And I think that the fact that all these people came together to honor this man in the form of voting for him, I think, was a statement to the effect that let's get something done and quit stalling not only on the economy, but on issues that concern the people of this country. I am just overwhelmed by the fact that if Congress doesn't move by the end of the year, they are going to, what is referred to, fall off the cliff. I am not an advocate of violence, but I do think that some of them should be pushed over that cliff. It's one thing to be rich, and it's another thing to be greedy. I don't say that we should take care of everybody's needs, because everybody's needs are not necessarily their needs. I learned a long time ago what you want and what you need are two different things. So your needs can multiply and triple, but your wants and your necessities are a roof over your head, I think food, and you get the gist of what I'm talking about. So I hope that we'll all come together, not just because of the election, but in a sense of unity throughout the country, so that we can get this thing moving and get it back on the right course. We've been headed in the wrong direction for quite a while, and now I think it's the time for us to get it all back together and see what's happening. Out of the 7th District, which is Lake Merced, the Park Merced area, those votes still haven't been counted, even though we have such modern age technology. We can pinpoint somebody's house in Timbuktu. We can't count the ballots that are here in San Francisco, but eventually we'll get to that. Even though we're able to put a man on the moon, or not a man, but a rocket on the moon that sends back glorious pictures and all this other technology, we are still having trouble counting those ballots. But we'll get to that momentarily, I'm sure, because somebody will come up with a research project that will, in maybe 5 or 10 years, solve that problem. And we will no longer have to stress behind that. And our votes will be counted and everything will be okay. It was interesting also the fact that even though the president had been declared as the winner, some people's ballots had still not been counted. Ridiculous, I don't know what you call it, but I would call it ridiculous. Anyway, moving right along. I took an article from the Guardian, and it is in regards to KCSM. And in case you don't know what that is, KCSM is a station that's been in business for 48 years, according to this article about a young lady named Tracy Rosenberg. And Ms. Rosenberg writes that the station is up for sale. It's a $5 million entity, and there are a lot of people that would like to have that station. Community radio, as we know it, has changed quite a bit. KPFA and various other stations that were in business quite a while back are no longer in existence. And this is all due to commercialism. People want to make money. And as I said before when I started, it's okay to be rich, but greed is just something that overwhelms me, and it just disturbs me quite a bit. And you should be disturbed also, because we need more community TV and radio as opposed to less. The internet has opened an area that makes available to all of us access to information that we would not necessarily be privy to, but there's still more information out there that needs to be shared. And community TV does a great job of providing this much needed service. Now, Ms. Rosenberg goes on to name some of the bidders involved in taking over of the station. And I don't know if you've seen it or not, but KCSM, pardon me, also has a jazz station that is dedicated to jazz 24 hours a day. And it plays excellent jazz music. We no longer have K-Jazz. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember K-Jazz, but K-Jazz was a station that was located across the bay, and they played some really fantastic jazz, and that was a 24-hour station also. But some of the personnel that were involved at K-Jazz moved over to KCSM. Now, the station was started as an educational facility, and eventually it became more of a vehicle for what was going on campus, and now it's dedicated partially to jazz. It also pays the I think Bill Moyer's program comes on KCSM, and it is the largest independent station, educational station, I like to say, in the country. They're not affiliated with PBS. They cut those ties, I think, back in 1996 and became the largest independent, which says quite a bit, because the programming, if you ever dial KCSM 60-1, 60-2, and 60-3, you see some of the really more informative programming. I love TV. I think TV is a wonderful thing, but between 7 and 10 o'clock in the evening on TV, you can bet your dollar that you're going to see somebody getting killed. And the blood just runs all over the TV, and it's ridiculous. We need to educate our children, and that, I don't think, has very much to do with their education, unless they're planning to become, what do you call it, the guys that go in and clean up their bodies and do all the research on that type of stuff. But otherwise, I can't really see the redeeming value in those type of programs. Now, you don't always have to sit and watch educational programming. That's not what I'm advocating. Variety is the spice of life. So you want to be sure and change it up a bit. But like I'm saying, there's a bit of overkill in the country in regards to our broadcasting facilities. There was a rule once that you could only own so many stations in one area, one marketing area, but I think that's been changed because now we have conglomerates that have TV stations and radio stations in the same area, and this is not regulated, I don't think, as it should be by the FCC. However, we'll just keep fighting and see what happens, and hopefully there'll be a change made in that direction. I am going to show you a clip from our collection of Black Enterprise films that was donated and dedicated to us by one of our beloved members, Gary, and we'd like to say hello to him, and we hope that you enjoy the programming. I will be back to say goodbye, and in the meantime, enjoy.
Was home to more blacks than any other northern city, including Chicago. Most of them lived uptown, in a particularly beautiful old neighborhood called Harlem. It was the home of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Urban League had its headquarters in Harlem. So did Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. The writer, James Weldon Johnson. The poet, Langston Hughes. The writer, Zora Neale Hurston. And the scholar and civil rights activist, W.E.B. Du Bois, all lived in Harlem, as did many other artists eagerly examining what it meant to be black and American, part of what would come to be called the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz musicians were drawn to Harlem too. There were plenty of theater and nightclub and dance hall jobs, and Broadway and the record companies were only a subway ride away. But to many middle-class blacks, jazz was an embarrassment, a vulgar, low-life music, unworthy of a race now committed to uplifting itself. But jazz could not be stopped.
Let the blare of Negro jazz bands penetrate the closed ears of the colored near intellectuals until they listen and perhaps understand. Let them cause the smug Negro middle class to turn from their white, respectable, ordinary books and papers and catch a glimmer of their own beauty. We younger artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful, and ugly too. The tom-tom cries, and the tom-tom laughs. Langston Hughes.
The musical heroes of Harlem were the masters of a dazzling virtuoso piano style, stride. It was orchestral piano, one of its stars remembered. Full, round, big, widespread chords moving against the right hand. Its practitioners called themselves ticklers. But the nicknames they awarded one another, the bear, the beetle, the beast, the brute, were warlike, befitting the perennial piano wars called cutting contests they waged among themselves. James P. Johnson was the elder statesman, a composer and conductor, as well as a pianist, who had made something altogether new out of ragtime. He had, in fact, written the tune that would define the jazz age. And his playing had helped inspire a young Duke Ellington to become a musician. Johnson was shy and soft-spoken most of the time. But he loved combat with other piano players so much, one of them remembered, that his wife would sometimes have to come to Harlem from Queens and go from street to street until she heard the piano, recognized his style, and then go up to the apartment to get him out of there and take him home. Johnson's greatest rival was his good friend William Henry Joseph Bonaparte Bertholoff Smith, Willie the Lion Smith, who sometimes said he had earned his nickname for bravery in battle during World War I, and at other times claimed he had been named the Lion of Judea because of his devotion to Judaism. Smith and Johnson customarily battled to a draw. It was never to the blood, a young piano player remembered. With those two giants, it was always a sporting event. Neither cut the other. They had too much respect for that. The two men were regulars at Harlem rent parties, all-night dances held in crowded apartments where the cost of admission helped hold off the landlord.
The Saturday night rent parties that I attended were often more amusing than any nightclub. In small apartments where God knows who lived because the guests seldom did, but where the piano would often be augmented by a guitar or an odd cornet or somebody with a pair of drums walking in off the street. And the dancing and singing and impromptu entertaining went on until dawn came in at the windows. Langston Hughes.
In early 1923, Duke Ellington, together with two old friends, the drummer Sonny Greer and the saxophonist Otto Hardwig, moved to Harlem, anxious to see if they had what it took to make it in the city jazz musicians would soon call the Big Apple. Harlem, in our minds, Ellington remembered, had the world's most glamorous atmosphere. We had to go there. His first job in New York was to accompany a vaudeville musician named Wilbur Sweatman, who insisted that members of his band use powder to lighten their complexions. When Sweatman left town, Ellington and his friends scuffled for work, sometimes hustling pool to feed themselves, but always listening to the stride piano masters. Willie the Lion Smith took a shine to Ellington and his friends. He steered Ellington toward pickup jobs, encouraged him to try his hand at cutting contests. In the fall of 1923, Duke Ellington, Sonny Greer, and Otto Hardwick moved downtown to play the Hollywood Inn, a cellar club just off Times Square. They were now part of a six-piece band called the Washingtonians that specialized in sweet dance music. It was led by a banjo player and small-time impresario named Elmer Snowden. When the men discovered that Snowden was pocketing more than his share of the band's pay, they forced him out and made Duke Ellington the new leader. It was at the Hollywood Inn, Ellington said, that our music acquired new colors and characteristics. He was absorbing everything. The ragtime he'd heard as a boy in Washington, the more sophisticated style of the Harlem Stride Masters, and the looser, blues-drenched New Orleans sounds of Sidney Bechet and Louis Armstrong. All of it would soon be reflected in his music.
In the beginning, he played society music, like he would say. So, they'd be playing along with that kind of vibrato. And then he heard King Oliver's band. And they were talking about... So he said, oh, okay, I want to do that. I want to hear that clarinet. I want to hear that trombone. I want that rhythm and that beat, the big four. Boom, 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 boom. So he started looking around for musicians who had that sound.
The most important addition to the band was a young trumpeter from South Carolina, a disciple of King Oliver, who carried Oliver's muted effects to new and startling heights. His name was James Bubber Miley. He used to growl all night long, playing gut bucket on his horn, Ellington said. That was when we decided to forget all about the sweet music.
And Duke said, we just threw all that polite music out the window and we went for the hot stuff. And the whole band changed when Bubber came in.
The band would stay at the Hollywood Inn for 4 years.
The Hollywood Inn was a terrible place to play. One of the things that you have to remember, of course, there was no air conditioning in those days. So a place like that in the summer would be absolutely unbearable, and they had to close it in the summer because there was no way anybody could stand it. Well, what they would do is sort of every Memorial Day, the gangsters who owned the place would torch it, shut it down, collect the insurance, and open it up again in the fall. And they got to the point where they would tell the guys in the band, they'd say, Sonny, to Sonny Greer, the drummer, I think you better take your drums home tonight. And the guys would clear out their instruments, and the next day the thing would be in flames. And that was the kind of joint. It was a rough club. It was a very rough club, even though it was right in the heart of glamorous Times Square.
After one of its strategically timed fires, the Hollywood Inn closed briefly, then reopened as the Club Kentucky, featuring the new hot sound of Duke Ellington.
Billboard. If anybody can tell us where a hotter aggregation than Duke Ellington and his Club Kentucky Serenaders can be found, we'll buy for the mob. Possessing a sense of rhythm that is almost uncanny, the boys in this dusky organization dispense a type of melody that stamps the outfit as the most tarred in town.
He drew from everything that was happening. From the movies, from Broadway, from religious music, from the blues, from Louis Armstrong, from King Oliver, from Jelly Roll Morton, from the competition with other bands, you know, like somebody come up with a little something he'd hear over and they say, oh, that would be good, I'll take that, put it over here and turn it into this. And then somebody'd hear his version of that and they say, ha, well, I'll take that back and I'll turn it into this. Then he'd say, oh, well, that's not a bad idea, I'll take that. And so that was going on too.
By 1924, Duke Ellington was making a name for himself in New York. He had begun to record and managed to sell some of his tunes to the song publishers of Tin Pan Alley. But he was still not satisfied, and he confessed his unhappiness to his friend Will Marion Cook, a classically trained conductor and Broadway composer. During long taxi rides through Central Park, the two men talked about music. Cook urged Ellington to get formal training at a conservatory. Ellington didn't feel he had time for that. They're not teaching what I want to learn, he said. In that case, Cook told him, first find the logical way, and when you find it, avoid it, and let your inner self break through and guide you. Don't try to be anybody but yourself. It was advice Duke Ellington would follow all his life.
Duke Ellington knew how to take what could be and make it what is. He understood what it took to make something invisible visible.
The greatest practitioners of this music have been African American. It comes from a particular kind of African American experience with democracy, with America, with capitalist society, with a whole bunch of other stuff. But it captured something about this culture and this society and this life that as soon as other people heard it, said, yeah, that's me.
Austin, Illinois was a well-to-do suburb where all the days were Sabbaths. A sleepy-time neighborhood big as a yawn and just about as lively, loaded with shade trees, clipped lawns, and a groggy-eyed population that never came out of its coma, except to turn over. Mesro.
Far from the Lincoln Gardens, where Louis Armstrong and Joe Oliver were holding forth, a group of high school boys in the prosperous Chicago neighborhood of Austin got together every day after school in the spring of 1923 to listen to jazz in an ice cream parlor called the Spoon and Straw.
It was just an ice cream parlor, but they had a Victrola there, and we used to sit around listening to records. One day we put on some new records by the New Orleans Rhythm Kings. Boy, when we heard that, I'll tell you, we were out of our minds. It was wonderful. We stayed there from about 3 in the afternoon until 8 at night, just listening to those records. And we decided we would get a band and try to play like these guys. Jimmy McPartland.
The aspiring young musicians included Jimmy McPartland, struggling to master the cornet, pianist Joe Sullivan, clarinetist Frank Teschmacher, tenor saxophonist Bud Freeman, and a would-be drummer from the still more prosperous suburb of Oak Park named Dave Tuff. They would come to be called the Austin High Gang.
Those boys, those high school kids heard something they never heard in their lives before. They may have been in the school band, possibly playing marches and stuff. But when they heard that, to them, it represented a vitality I'd never experienced before. And they soared with it. Jimmy would say, we just flew.
The Austin High Gang's first heroes were the New Orleans Rhythm Kings. They were white musicians who modeled their own distinctive style, in part, on the music King Oliver was playing on the South Side. Soon, the members of the Austin High Gang and dozens of other young white kids decided to find out for themselves the source of the new music they found irresistible. They risked the ridicule of their friends and the disapproval of their parents to travel to the Lincoln Gardens to hear Joe Oliver and Louis Armstrong play.
When these white kids come down to hear King Oliver and Louis Armstrong and playing this music, we have to realize that this is some of the most abstract and sophisticated music that anybody has ever heard, short of Bach. But they've been taught their entire lives that nothing of any good can come out of some niggers.
So here are these kids, and here is this new music that is not legitimate in any way. Well, maybe when they first went to hear it, it was just part of something, the sort of excitement, rebellion, Then they hear it and they realize, oh, they want to join this world. They want to be jazz musicians. They want to become part of something that's new and great. They have to sense that, and that these black people have to teach them.
And that's how it always is in myth. Cinderella, the one who you keep out and you push down and you kick, that's the one with the moral authority, with the gift. That's as old as night and day. That's as old as dust. And it's not about black or white. But here it is now, that same myth in black and white. If you're a trumpet player and you hear Louis Armstrong, you want to play like him. Not because he's black, because that's the greatest trumpet you've ever heard. That's what you want to play like.
It was by and for Negroes. And the white kids in short pants who went there, some of them on bicycles, to hear the music, had good reason to feel slightly uncomfortable until they had pushed their way close to the bandstand and had been recognized by Oliver. A nod or a wave of his hand was all that was necessary. Then the customers knew that the kids were all right. Night after night, we made the trip. We sat there stiff with education, joy, and a licorice-tasting gin purchased from the waiters for $2 a pint. Oliver and Louis would roll on and on, piling up choruses with the rhythm section building the beat until the whole thing got inside your head and blew your brains out. Eddie Condon.
The young white musicians who had ventured to the South Side now started to develop their own brand of jazz. A blend of New Orleans music with a more agitated, aggressive, northern sound. It would soon be called Chicago style.
As they began to develop, they did develop a style of their own idiosyncrasies, their own stylistic gambits. And they had a lot of feeling and energy, and they were wild men. Eddie Condon said when we came to town, the Republicans, ran for cover. But when they were young, they were among the first to go out into explore this black music and try to claim it for themselves.
Chicago had become, one musician proudly remembered, the jazz capital of the United States. But while whites were able to go to the South Side and hear the music of King Oliver and Louis Armstrong, blacks were not welcome in any club downtown. There was, in fact, no jazz band in America in which blacks and whites played side by side.
Well, the rule said that we could not play together, black and whites together, but it had nothing to do with our respect for each other as musicians, individual musicians. So after hours, when the clubs would close, the musician, black and white, would get together. White musicians could come to the South Side, and after hours, when they got off from their jobs, they would come and we would trade courses. And we would get some of the academics from the white musician, and they'd get some of the creativity from the black musician. And we had what we called breakfast dances, went on 5 o'clock in the morning after everything was closed. And we had this great jam session going. And this is why Chicago was the basis of really putting this together, because we found out that music is an auditory art. We didn't care what color you were or where you came from. It's how you sound.
We first met, Jazz and I, at a dance hall dive at the Barbary Coast. It screeched and bellowed at me from a trick platform in the middle of a smoke-hazed, beer-fumed room, and it hit me hard. Raucous? Yes. Crude? Undoubtedly. Musical? As sure as you live. Paul Whiteman.
Paul Whiteman was a formerly trained violinist from Colorado who abandoned a symphonic career after hearing a jazz band one night in San Francisco.
Absolutely knocked him out. It was so driving. It was so much fun. He got up that morning with the blues. He went home that night feeling floating, and had a great time. Now, his way of thinking, because of his training, his background, his father as a music educator, playing viola in a symphony orchestra, immediately he is thinking not about playing it that way, but about converting it his way.
Whiteman was convinced that he could find a way to orchestrate jazz, to make it even more commercially viable, to retain its rhythm and harmony while rendering it as precise and predictable as classical music. His arrangements were intended, he said, to make a lady out of jazz.
His concern all the time was that this is an amazingly important art form. We just need to be able to score it. We need to be able to get teams of musicians who can play it. We just need to be able to take it from its primitive state.
His first big hit had come in 1920 with Whispering. Soothing, heavily orchestrated, it sold 2.5 million copies. More than 250 times what Armstrong and Oliver's Chimes Blues would sell. Paul Whiteman's orchestra soon became the most celebrated and most imitated in America, launching a whole new trend in society dance music. On February 12, 1924, a big crowd turned out to hear the Paul Whiteman Orchestra play what was billed as an experiment in modern music at Aeolian Hall in New York City. The concert included a brand new specially commissioned work by a young New York songwriter, the son of Jewish immigrants named George Gershwin, who, like Duke Ellington, had spent hours listening to black piano players in Harlem. Gershwin's composition was something altogether new, a classical piece suffused with jazz feeling, and it would become one of the best-loved compositions in all of American music. Rhapsody in Blue. The concert was a huge success. 4 hours of elegant and orchestral music without a hint of improvisation. But almost immediately, Paul Whiteman was billed as the king of jazz.
And of course, it's driving many blacks at the time and since crazy because, it's all too obvious. Paul Whiteman equals king of jazz. Whiteman himself actually never seems to have pretended to be any such thing.
Critics would one day accuse Whiteman of diluting jazz, of stealing from black Americans. But Whiteman himself always acknowledged the debt he owed.
White people went into jazz not with the idea that they were going to make fun of black people or that it was going to be degrading to black people, but that here was an art form that they were willing to take on its own terms and wanted to express and actually wanted to respect and elevate. This is what makes Paul Whiteman important. He wanted to take the music on something like its own terms. This was going to redound on everyone associated with this music, whether you're white or black.
Whiteman gave behind-the-scenes work to black arrangers and wanted to hire black musicians for his orchestra. But even in the jazz age, that was impossible. The same year as Whiteman's triumph at Aeolian Hall, a young black band leader named Fletcher Henderson opened at New York's premier ballroom, Roseland in Times Square, playing for white dancers only. Henderson was the soft-spoken son of a piano teacher and a school principal, and he had come north to New York to pursue a graduate degree in chemistry at Columbia. But when his savings ran out, he turned to music and was swept up in the jazz craze. At Roseland, he made himself famous for playing dance music with a polish unmatched by any other black band leader since James Reese Europe.
There were two kings of the band scene in New York. There was the white king, Paul Whiteman, who had the best white musicians in the country, and there was Fletcher Henderson, the king of the black musicians, who had the best black musicians in the country. And they were friends, and they helped each other and traded arrangements and so forth.
One evening, Whiteman took his band to hear Henderson's, then told his men if Fletcher was a white man, he would be a millionaire. But like Duke Ellington, Henderson grew restless with the polite dance music he was playing. He was determined to create a style all his own, wanted to combine the elegance of his formal arrangements with something more exciting, more driving, more spontaneous. Fletcher Henderson began to look for a soloist, a jazz specialist, he called it, who could help him out. He knew of a trumpet player in King Oliver's band in Chicago, whose genius other musicians were beginning to talk about. It would take him a while, but when he persuaded that specialist to come to New York, it would change jazz forever.
Jazz is the ultimate temporal art form. It's about the human experience of time. How is time embodied? So you listen to Louis playing a quarter note, and suddenly your whole experience of that day has changed. You hear him playing this one quarter note, and time is not moving along in the way that it normally moves along. He was the first person to embody abstraction musically. Other people used abstraction in music, but over time, composers would sit down and take an idea and toy with it over time. But Louis could spontaneously take a melody and abstract it, that is, remove all the unessentials from this melody and be left with just this pure vision of what the melody could be.
His sound, more than anything, his sound had a light in it. That's the only way I can describe it. You can't practice to get that. it's like it's a spiritual presence. And when that light is in your sound, it just, when you hear it, it attracts you.
For nearly 2 years, Louis Armstrong stayed in King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. The band also included a piano player named Lil Hardin. She was unlike any woman Louis Armstrong had ever met.
All along, I've been hearing from all the musicians about Little Louis, and what a good trumpet player he was gonna be, Little Louis. So when he brought Little Louis over to the Dreamland to meet me, Little Louis was 226 pounds. So I said, Little Louis, how come you call him Little Louis, as big as he is? I wasn't impressed at all. I didn't like anything about him. I didn't like the way he's dressed. I didn't like the way he talked. Anyway, he came up on the bandstands, and I used to play, girls wore garters, on their stockings. So when I'd sit down to play, I would roll my stocking down so the garters below my knee. And first thing Louis spied was my knee, and he was looking. And I said, this guy's got ideas he'd better not put in words.
Lil Hardin was ambitious, articulate, and like Armstrong, unhappily married. Despite her first impression, she fell in love with him. On February 5th, 1924, Louis Armstrong, just divorced from his first wife, married Lil Hardin in Chicago. Once married, Lil went to work on her new husband.
Lil decided she was going to make Louis over, and she tried to get him to lose a little weight. She took him out and bought him some proper clothes so he looked more like a Chicago slick than a New Orleans hick. And then she decided, that he ought to be out on his own. He ought to be out from underneath the wing of Joe Oliver.
I probably would have never paid any attention to Louis' playing if King Oliver hadn't said to me one night that Louis could play better than he could. He says, but as long as I keep him with me, he won't be able to get ahead of me. I'll still be the king.
Lil urged Armstrong to strike out on his own, but he was reluctant to leave the man he still called Mr. Joe. He owed him a lot, he said, and wasn't sure he could make it on his own. But Lil persisted. I don't want to be married to a second trumpet player, she told him. I want you to play first. Then, in the spring of 1924, Armstrong got an offer he could not ignore. Fletcher Henderson wanted him to come to New York. Like his arrival in Chicago 2 years earlier, Armstrong's debut in New York was not auspicious.
The drummer Kaiser Marshall had a car and brought us downtown to meet Louis. He was big and fat and wore high-top shoes with hooks in them. When I got a load of that, I said to myself, who in the hell is this guy? It can't be Louis Armstrong. Don Redman.
Louis Armstrong, raised poor on the streets of New Orleans, could not have been more different from his sophisticated new employer. But almost from the start, Armstrong was influencing every other jazz musician in town.
I came to New York in 1924. That was the first time that I heard Louis in person. So Fletcher didn't have no music for him at that period. So he was just sitting up there like this, with his trumpet in his hand and waiting for his courses. So when he got his courses, he was standing up and playing like hell. And the people would just rave.
Armstrong's choruses transformed the band. Henderson's arranger, Don Redman, now began writing new pieces that showcased Armstrong's soaring horn and his unprecedented sense of rhythm, what Henderson himself called Armstrong's New Orleans punch and bounce.
One night at Roseland, Armstrong began Shanghai Shuffle. I think they made him play 10 choruses. And I stood silent, feeling almost bashful, asking myself if I would ever be able to attain a small part of Armstrong's greatness. Coleman Hawkins.
Armstrong transformed the orchestra, transformed all the musicians in it, and ultimately transformed all the musicians in New York who were playing jazz and even popular musicians. He brought, first of all, a tremendous rhythmic excitement. Armstrong was an economist, you know. He played very few notes, but every note counted and it stood for something. Then, equally important, he brought the blues. Armstrong demonstrated that the blues might be the greatest musical gift ever to come out of America. And he played it with such conviction and such feeling and force that everybody wanted that. I mean, Duke Ellington was already in New York. He was accompanying singers. He had a small band of his own, but he was missing something. He didn't know what he was missing until he heard Armstrong.
Armstrong's great contribution is impossible to notate, but it is the characteristic that most clearly defines jazz: swing.
Swing is getting the right note at the right time, not before or not after. So in jazz, which is a rhythmic music, you've got to have the time and you got to have the pulse. You're gonna be playing, you say, do 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 do. You can't say do 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 do. You got to say do 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 do. She do be do 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 do. Keep that going. Don't move. That's way. And believe me when I tell you, that's like a heartbeat. And you look at the audience, they'll get it. And you see them first start patting their foot, and then you're gonna see them, they're gonna get up and they're gonna start swinging around. That's what makes jazz so unique and so great.
No one musician said, knew what swinging was till Louis came along.
Louis Armstrong's arrival in September of '24 is pivotal because he's the most important jazz musician on the face of the earth, and he's coming to the country's biggest city, playing with its most important band and teaching them how to swing. Uptown, he plays dances for the young black adolescents and turns careers around, like Rex Stewart's Gene Rogers, and the man who played in the saxophone section for Duke Ellington, Russell Procope. He was a violinist when he heard Fat Armstrong, and he said, man, I'm going with a horn that you can make this music with, and he switched to alto saxophone. Plus, New York was the hotbed of recording activity, and the great Louis Armstrong gets to make freelance record dates. He records with Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, and Clarence Williams' Blue Five with Sidney Bechet. And those records get to audiences who can't even make it to Roseland or go uptown. Jazz arrives because Louis came to New York and taught the world to swing.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a little trip through the jungle this time, and we want y'all to travel with us. That tiger's running so fast, we're going to take a few choruses to catch him. So I want y'all to count with me. Yes, sir. This little silver trumpet's gonna get away for you this time. Let out there, boys. I'm ready. Yeah.
Okay, I certainly hope we enjoyed the clip, and I'd like to make mention of the fact that we also have a website set up. It's www.sfdominoclub, that's one word, sfdominoclub.org, and you can contact us at sfdominoclub@gmail.com, and we'll be more than happy to respond to any suggestions that you might have. We never take anything as a criticism because we always learn and try and improve the show as much as possible, and we hope that you do the same. Now, we have coming up the holidays, and the people that are suffering because of what happened in New York and on the West Coast, East Coast, pardon me, are in dire need. And I'm not an advocate of soliciting funds for anybody, but I am an advocate of prayer. So the best that I can do is to pray for those people and hope that God will restore their electricity, their water, and that they will have some semblance of a holiday. I've always had a problem with Thanksgiving because the true meaning of Thanksgiving has been sort of distorted. And I don't want to say sort of distorted, it has been extremely distorted. If you read history, and history is sometimes his story, the Native Americans made the newcomers very welcome, and they were taken advantage of, and that remains until today to be a truism, if you will. I like to invent words. But anyway, we give thanks to God, and about the rest of it, we'll just have to wing it and figure it out for ourselves on the way home. I'd like to thank my mother for supporting me, and I will see her pretty soon because I'm going to be in New Orleans. And I will, of course, leave my heart in San Francisco, but I will be back, and I hope that while I am away, you will have a wonderful holiday season. Hopefully we'll have another program to air prior to my departure. If not, I will see you when I see you. If I do, we'll try to make it a very interesting program as usual. Thank you once again for tuning in to Cable Access Channel 29 and 76, and we will see you when we see you. Peace out.